They say history is written by the victors, but what happens when victory costs everything? For the British Empire, winning the world wars was the very thing that sealed its fate. Imagine an empire so vast the sun never set on it, reduced to a nation struggling to feed its own people. This isn't a story of military defeat, but of economic collapse, of victory so expensive it led to total ruin. At the dawn of the 20th century, Britain was the world's banker. Its currency, the pound sterling, was the global standard. Nations held their reserves in pounds, and international trade was conducted through London. Britain wasn't just a political empire, it was a financial one. But this financial dominance was about to be shattered. When the First World War broke out in 1914, no one anticipated the sheer scale of its cost. The war consumed men, materials, and money at an unprecedented rate. To finance this industrial-scale conflict, Britain began a fire sale of its global assets. Investments in railways in Argentina, factories in the United States, and mines in South Africa built up over generations were sold off. Liquidated to buy shells and bullets, the money poured out, but it wasn't enough. So, Britain started borrowing, turning to its closest ally and emerging economic rival, the United States. By the end of the war in 1918, Britain was no longer the world's primary creditor. It was deeply in debt, primarily to America. The interwar years were a period of uneasy recovery. Britain tried to regain its financial footing, but the global economy was fragile. The Great Depression hit hard, and just as things seemed to be stabilizing, the storm clouds gathered once more. When the Second World War began in 1939, Britain's economic position was already precarious. What followed was the final, fatal blow. The fight against Nazi Germany was a fight for survival, and the cost was astronomical. Britain threw everything it had into the war effort. Once again, it liquidated its remaining overseas assets. Once again, it turned to the United States for help. This time, the scale of borrowing was even greater. The old system of cash and carry, where Britain paid upfront for American supplies, quickly became unsustainable. By 1941, Britain was, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. This is where the dynamic between the two great English-speaking powers fundamentally shifted. The United States, led by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, understood that a British collapse would be a disaster for American security. But America was also a nation founded on anti-colonial principles. It saw the British Empire, with its exclusive trading blocs and imperial preferences, as an outdated system that hindered free trade, the very system America wanted to lead. This led to the creation of the Lend-Lease Act in 1941. On the surface, it was a lifeline. The U.S. would lend or lease military supplies to any nation deemed vital to its defense, with payment deferred until after the war. It was, as Roosevelt described it, like lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. You don't ask for payment upfront, you just want the hose back after the fire is out. But this hose came with strings attached. Significant, empire-altering strings. The Lend-Lease agreements were a tool of financial leverage. The United States used them to pressure Britain into dismantling its imperial trade system, the so-called Sterling Area, which gave preferential treatment to countries within the empire. America wanted an open world for its goods, and Britain's financial desperation gave them the perfect opportunity to demand it. When the war ended in 1945, Britain was victorious but economically broken. It had accumulated a staggering debt, equivalent to over 100% of its GDP. The country had spent a quarter of its entire national wealth on the war. The infrastructure was battered, its cities bombed, and its industries worn out. The promised hose from America wasn't going to be returned, it was going to be paid for. The Lend-Lease program was abruptly terminated just days after Japan's surrender, plunging Britain into an immediate financial crisis. This led to the Anglo-American Loan of 1946. Desperate for funds to rebuild, and even just to import food, Britain had to negotiate another massive loan from the United States. The terms were harsh. Britain had to agree to make the pound sterling fully convertible to the US dollar within a year. This was a catastrophic move. When convertibility was introduced in 1947, there was a massive run on the pound. Everyone who held sterling tried to convert it to the more stable and powerful US dollar. Britain's dollar reserves were wiped out in a matter of weeks. The convertibility had to be suspended, but the damage was done. The pound's status as the world's reserve currency was gone forever. The US dollar was now king. The financial ruin had a direct impact on Britain's ability to maintain its empire. Policing a quarter of the globe required a massive military presence, and a military requires money. But at home, the British people were living under severe austerity. Food rationing, which had been introduced during the war, continued and in some cases became even stricter. Bread, which was never rationed during the war, was rationed in 1946. Rationing of some items, like sugar and meat, would continue all the way until 1954, 9 years after the war had ended. This was the ultimate paradox, the concept known as imperial overstretch. How could a government justify spending vast sums of money to maintain garrisons in India, Palestine, and Malaya when its own citizens at home were queuing for bread and living in bombed-out houses? The logistical and financial nightmare was unsustainable. The empire had become a luxury Britain could no longer afford. The military could not be maintained, the administration could not be funded, and the political will at home was evaporating. The economic reality was stark. The very act of fighting to save the empire had bankrupted it. The victory against Germany had been won, but the price was Britain's global dominance. The United States, now the undisputed economic and military superpower, had its own vision for the post-war world, a world of free markets and self-determination, at least in principle. It had no interest in propping up the old colonial empires. Through loans and financial pressure, it actively accelerated their dismantlement. So, when we look at the end of the British Empire, it's easy to focus on the flags coming down and the independence movements rising up. But beneath it all was a foundation of cracked and crumbling finances. The two world wars didn't just drain the treasury, they transferred global power across the Atlantic. Britain entered the 20th century as the world's creditor and the ruler of a vast empire. It exited the Second World War as the world's biggest debtor, a nation relying on American aid, unable to afford the very empire it had fought so hard to defend. The cost of victory was, in the end, the empire itself. Within the empire itself, the ground was shifting. The very people who had been subjugated were now demanding their freedom, and this fire of nationalism would prove impossible to extinguish. Nowhere was this more significant than in India, the so-called jewel in the crown of the British Empire. For centuries, India had been Britain's most prized and profitable possession. Its vast resources, markets, and manpower were the bedrock of British imperial power. But by 1947, a relentless independence movement, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, finally forced Britain's hand. India's departure was a seismic shock to the system. It wasn't just about losing territory or resources, it was a profound symbolic blow. If Britain couldn't hold on to India, could it hold on to anything? The loss also had huge strategic implications. The formidable Indian army had long served as Britain's policemen across Asia and the Middle East, enforcing British will and protecting its interests. Without it, a massive power vacuum emerged, one that a weakened Britain simply couldn't fill. The empire's enforcer was gone, and the message to other colonies was clear. The master's grip was failing. If the loss of India was a deep wound, the Suez Crisis of 1956 was the moment the world watched Britain bleed out. The whole affair was a humiliating demonstration of Britain's changed status. The Suez Canal, a vital waterway connecting Europe to Asia, was nationalized by Egypt's leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser. For Britain, this was an unacceptable challenge to its prestige and economic interests. In a throwback to the old days of gunboat diplomacy, Britain, along with France and Israel, conspired to invade Egypt and retake the canal by force. The initial military operation was a success, but the political fallout was catastrophic. The United States, under President Eisenhower, was furious. The invasion risked pushing the Arab world towards the Soviet Union and destabilizing the entire Middle East. Eisenhower delivered a brutal ultimatum to British Prime Minister Anthony Eden. He threatened to sell off the U.S. government's holdings of the British pound sterling, an act that would have triggered a total collapse of the British economy. Faced with financial ruin, a humiliated Britain was forced to withdraw its troops with its tail between its legs. The message was broadcast loud and clear for the entire world to see. Britain was no longer a great power. It could no longer act independently on the world stage. Without the permission of the new superpower, the United States, the Suez Crisis shattered the illusion of British strength and emboldened nationalist movements everywhere. The emperor, it turned out, had no clothes. This new reality was officially acknowledged just a few years later. In 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan embarked on a tour of Africa. In a landmark address to the South African Parliament, he delivered what would become known as the Wind of Change speech. He spoke of a powerful wind of change blowing through this continent, a tide of national consciousness that was a political fact. This speech wasn't just rhetoric. It was a formal declaration of a new British policy. Macmillan was signaling to the world, and especially to white settler populations in Africa, that the era of fighting to maintain colonial rule was over. Britain would no longer resist the push for independence. This announcement accelerated the decolonization of Africa at a breathtaking pace. Following Ghana's lead in 1957, countries like Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Tanganyika quickly gained their sovereignty. Kenya, after a long and bitter struggle, would follow in 1963. Macmillan's speech effectively set a timetable for the end of the British Empire in Africa, accepting the inevitable and trying to manage the decline rather than fruitlessly resist it. The wind of change was a pragmatic acceptance of reality, but this reality had been shaped by years of costly and bloody conflict. Britain's will to rule wasn't just broken by financial strain or diplomatic humiliation, it was worn down in the jungles and mountains of its colonies. The post-war years were filled with a series of brutal, draining conflicts often called small wars or insurgencies. In Malaya, a 12-year-long conflict known as the Malayan Emergency saw British and Commonwealth forces fighting a communist insurgency deep in the jungle. While ultimately a military success for the British, it was immensely costly in both lives and treasure. An even more vicious conflict erupted in Kenya with the Mau Mau uprising. This was a rebellion by the Kikuyu people against British rule and the loss of their lands to white settlers. The British response was ruthless, involving mass detentions in camps, torture, and brutal counterinsurgency tactics. The campaign exposed the grim reality of maintaining an empire by force and generated significant controversy back in Britain. These wars, along with others in places like Cyprus and Aden, demonstrated a painful truth. Holding on to an empire against the will of its people required a level of brutality and expense that the post-war British public and treasury were no longer willing to stomach. The moral and financial cost of constantly policing a resentful world was simply too high. Each guerrilla campaign, each casualty, and each pound spent was another nail in the coffin of the empire. Britain had lost the economic strength, the global authority, and finally, the political will to rule by force. The fire of nationalism had proven too hot to handle. The end of empire wasn't a clean, organized affair. In many ways, the global disaster was just beginning, as hasty withdrawals and redrawn maps ignited fires that still burn today. The British Empire, once a symbol of global order, left behind a legacy of chaos, conflict, and a profoundly reshaped world. Perhaps nowhere was this tragedy more apparent than in the Indian subcontinent. The year 1947 marked the end of the British Raj, but the departure was so rushed, so poorly planned, that it resulted in one of the greatest humanitarian disasters of the 20th century. The decision to partition British India into two independent nations, India and Pakistan, was based on religious lines. What followed was a cataclysm, a line drawn on a map by a British lawyer who had never visited India, before suddenly divided villages, families, and centuries of shared history. This act triggered a massive, violent wave of migration. An estimated 15 million people were displaced, forced to abandon their homes and flee to the country where their religion was the majority. Hindus and Sikhs scrambled to get to India, while Muslims fled to Pakistan. The journey was fraught with unimaginable horror. Trains carrying refugees were attacked, convoys were ambushed, and entire communities were slaughtered in brutal sectarian violence. The exact death toll is unknown, but estimates range from several 100,000 to over 1 million people. The partition of India was not a peaceful transfer of power. It was a bloodbath, a direct consequence of a colonial exit strategy that prioritized speed over human life, leaving behind a wound of division and trauma that continues to define relations between India and Pakistan to this day. This pattern of leaving behind unresolved conflicts repeated itself across the globe. Take the Middle East, a region whose modern map and enduring tensions are deeply rooted in the collapse of empire. In 1948, Britain terminated its mandate for Palestine. This abandonment, as some historians call it, was done without a clear, agreed-upon solution for the competing nationalist aspiration of Jewish and Arab populations. The moment the British flag was lowered, the First Arab-Israeli War erupted. The unresolved questions of borders, sovereignty, and the status of Jerusalem plunged the region into a conflict that has lasted for generations. The British withdrawal didn't solve the problem. It simply handed it over to the people on the ground, who were now left to fight over the legacy of broken promises and colonial-era policies. Further east, In the Persian Gulf, a similar story unfolded. In 1971, Britain withdrew its military presence from the Gulf states, which had been British protectorates for decades. This power vacuum didn't lead to immediate stability. Instead, it created anxieties among the newly independent and relatively small Arab monarchies, unresolved border disputes between these states, many of which had been kept in check by British authority, suddenly became potential flashpoints. Furthermore, the withdrawal left the region more vulnerable to the ambitions of larger, more powerful neighbors like Iran and Iraq. The sectarian tensions between Sunni and Shia Muslims, which had been managed under the imperial umbrella, now had space to grow and be exploited by regional powers. The conflicts that had defined the Middle East for the past 50 years, from the Iran-Iraq War to the Gulf War and beyond, can all trace their origins back to this period of imperial retreat, where old structures of power were dismantled without new, stable ones to replace them. The legacy was not one of peace, but a muddle of contested borders and deep-seated sectarian divides. Faced with the undeniable collapse of its territorial empire, Britain sought a new way to project its influence on the world stage. The answer was the Commonwealth of Nations. This was a clever and strategic pivot, an attempt to transform the very nature of its global relationships. The old, hierarchical structure of empire, with Britain at its center ruling over colonies and dominions, was no longer tenable. So, it was replaced with the idea of a voluntary association of free and independent states. The Commonwealth was framed not as a relic of empire, but as a family of nations united by shared history, language, and values like democracy and the rule of law. Membership was open to former British territories, and crucially, it was a partnership of equals. The Queen would remain as a symbolic head, but she held no political power over the member states. This was Britain's masterstroke in managing its decline. It was an acknowledgement that its hard power, its military, and economic ability to compel other nations had vanished. In its place, Britain hoped to cultivate soft power by leading this global network. It could still exert influence through diplomacy, culture, trade, and shared institutions. The Commonwealth Games, for example, became a friendly sporting competition that reinforced these cultural ties. Educational exchanges and legal systems based on English common law also helped maintain a sense of connection. In essence, Britain was trying to trade its crown for a chairman's gavel, hoping to remain a significant global player not through command, but through consensus and cooperation. It was a pragmatic adaptation to a world where it was no longer the ruler, but just one voice among many, albeit a historically significant one. The final act in this grand imperial retreat was not a pivot to a new global role, but a turn inward, towards its own continent. The decision to join the European Economic Community, or EEC, in 1973 was a monumental moment in British history. For centuries, Britain's foreign policy had been defined by its global reach and its deliberate distance from the entanglements of mainland Europe. The empire was its focus, the sea was its domain, and Europe was a continent of rivals to be managed from afar. Joining the EEC was a complete reversal of this long-standing tradition. It was a tacit admission that Britain's future no longer lay across the oceans, in its former colonies, but across the English Channel with its European neighbors. The economic realities were stark. The old imperial trading system had crumbled. Britain's economy was struggling, often referred to as the sick man of Europe. The burgeoning EEC, on the other hand, represented a dynamic and growing market. The choice was clear: embrace Europe or risk being left behind. This was more than just an economic calculation. It was a profound psychological shift. It signaled the final, definitive acceptance that the era of Britain as a global hegemon, a power upon which the sun never sets, was well and truly over. The nation that had once ruled a quarter of the world's population was now seeking to become a member of a regional bloc. The retreat from empire was complete. Britain had transitioned from a global power to a European one, forever changing its identity and its place in the world. The legacy of that empire, its triumphs, its injustices, and the chaotic manner of its end would continue to shape global politics for the rest of the century and beyond, a complex and often painful inheritance for both Britain and the nations it once ruled.